Hi everyone, welcome to today's episode on fast intelligent care on why recliner fit or recliner size matters when you're doing your recliner chair prescriptions. And we'll also go through how your bariatric clients would be a little bit different in terms of how you look at your size chair, how you adjust your chair. It is a little bit different in terms of how we look at our three dimensions: seat width, height, and depth, because a lot of times our bariatric chairs actually upsize everything. So your bariatric chair is typically going to require a wider seat, but it doesn't always mean I need a higher seat height or a deeper seat depth, because your client actually has a lot of additional adipose tissue or additional body mass that takes up space. So if we look at how we take measurements for non-bariatric client, we usually look at the space behind the knee and the base of the spine when we're doing a seat depth measurement. But if you have someone with big calves and what we call a gluteal shelf, so additional body mass by the buttocks, if you take that measurement from behind the knee to the base of the spine, so just behind the buttocks, you're going to have a very deep seat, and the person's actually going to struggle with the seat being too deep and actually end up sitting with that posterior pelvic tilt posture, that sacral sitting posture. Because if you can imagine, their buttocks are taking up quite a bit of space, and there's actually this gap behind their back and the backrest, because the buttocks are the first thing that gets in contact with the backrest and actually stopping their back from being in contact with the backrest. You're going to have that person then lean back in that posterior pelvic tilt, and they're possibly going to want to actually add in additional pillow behind their back to support their back. Otherwise, they're going to start getting back pain because their lower back is going to be unsupported and that weight isn't going to be distributed. So a bariatric client definitely requires adjustments in how their measurements are taken. You're going to have to take into account the calves. You're going to have to take into account the gluteal shaft or the buttocks. When you look at your seat height, you're going to have someone possibly with larger thighs. So again, if you're going into the back of the knee, you're actually going to end up with a too high seat, and the person's going to have a lot of pressure going into the behind the knees and front of the thighs. So you actually want to take your measurement instead of from the back of the knee, which you would do for your non-bariatric client. You're actually going from the lowest point of your thighs and to the feet or to the floor. So there's a bit of that adjustment. But when we're looking at our seat width measurements with our bariatric clients, it's going to be very similar to your non-bariatric clients, where you just go from the widest point of the hips or even the thighs, but always take into account the person's body shape. So that's why it's not always the hips, because someone might have narrow hips but bigger thighs, or they might have narrow hips but a bigger tummy if it's more an apple shape, whereas your pear shape is going to have wide hips, and maybe their thighs aren't going to be take up as much space. So as long as you're taking into account the widest point and you're measuring from one side to the other and adding on that inch to your width measurement, because something I have seen as well is your bariatric clients sometimes have a big tummy that they end up sitting between their legs. So the tummy sits kind of between the legs. So the legs are almost kind of a little bit splayed outwards or turned outwards with the tummy in between. And if they're sitting when you're maybe doing your measurements, you might find that you're doing measurements from the widest point of the hips, but when they're sitting the tummy between the legs, their widest point is actually along the legs. And you actually need a little bit more space to actually allow for that additional body mass. So quite a few things to take into account they do tend to have a lot of fluctuation in their weight. A lot of times it can be fluid, but you can have a client that can lose or gain 10 kilograms in a very short span of time. And then you might have a chair that's too narrow, so they can't fit into it, or too wide, and they don't have that sufficient armrest support, or a chair that is just not supportive enough in terms of postural supports as well. So bariatric chairs also have that need for a modular chair. And for example, can the overhang be switched over so that instead of the overhang being on the inside of the chair towards the person, can the overhang be on the outside and actually open up that space a little bit? Especially for those pear-shaped clients where you do have a narrow upper body and you want to have the armrest close to the body, but you want to have that little bit of space by the hips. So just having the armrest overhang and not having a too narrow size of the chair could help for that. Let's just go briefly through just some general measuring tips when you are doing a recliner chair prescription. So always use a hard tape measure. It makes it a lot easier because we're going to avoid that bending during measurements. It's going to be a lot more accurate measurement. But if you are using the soft tape measure, just make sure you're pulling it really nice and tight. And I really do like using clipboards as much as I can. So having clipboard on each side of the hips or the thighs, or having a clipboard at the back of the person's buttocks or base of the spine, and that's going to be my measurement point, and having maybe a pen go into the back of someone's knee so that I have very clear measurement points to go from. Or even using your clipboard underneath the person's thighs when you're doing your bariatric chair measurements, or back of the calves as well, because then you're making sure that your measurement is from the furthest point of the calves, or the furthest point or lowest point of the thighs. So really good to use at least 2 clipboards, using a straight tape measure and a pen. And then also looking at someone's posture, making sure that when you are taking those measurements, the person is in a neutral posture or their ideal posture as much as possible, because that's going to make sure that we're taking those measurements correctly. And also looking at, is there a fixed posture or a reducible posture? So if I have someone that is sitting in a poor posture, can I, with support, get them into a more, upright, neutral posture, and then take the measurements in that way? And making sure that I'm doing what we call kind of like an instability check, where you're actually measuring from both sides, because you could have someone that has a pelvic rotation where one hip is more in front of the other one. So you actually looks like a leg length discrepancy. But when you actually measure the person, you'll realize that it's actually their hips that are rotated hand. And you might have someone that actually does have a leg length discrepancy. So they might actually have their seat depth measurements might be different one side of their body to the other, or their seat height on one side might be different to the other side. And you do need to take that into account, because you want to make sure that we're adapting our chair measurements for both sides. We don't want to have a chair that, let's say it's one that has an incorrect seat height because I measured the longer leg. Now my seat height's too high. One leg's dangling, the other one's supported on the floor. It does help if you have an all-around view. So having clear access around the person when you are doing your measurements, to make sure that you can see all sides, front and back, when you are doing your measurements, and there's not, a armrest or a chair backrest that's really preventing you from getting accurate measurements. So if you can measure someone on a very solid surface, like could be a dining chair, could be a plinth, ideally not on something that is too immersive. So ideally not on someone's bed, unless they have a very firm mattress, but ideally you want to have a really solid, firm surface to measure from. And when you are measuring for a seating system, ideally you want to have someone in that really good upright seated 90-degree position. So try and achieve that when you're doing your measurements. So if you are sitting on a chair that is too high for the person when you're doing the measurements, try and simulate that correct seat height. So try and get their legs at that 90-degree angle, or their knees at that 90-degree angle. So you might need to put a foot block underneath their feet. Or I've worked in the hospital where we used stacks of magazines, or we used those old telephone books where you actually try and simulate having the right seat height, because what you're measuring from might not be correct. So try and just achieve that ideal posture and then measure the person in that ideal posture. Another error that people do make is actually not considering someone's footwear when they're doing the measurements. So this could be someone that is sitting with, let's say, high heels when you're doing the measurement, but at home they're not going to be wearing high heels. They're going to be barefoot, or they're going to be wearing sandals or slippers. So we don't want to just measure without considering what the footwear is going to be, because that can completely throw off our measurements. And then lastly, you can measure someone in supine or in a lying position if they are struggling to sit upright independently. Or even if you have someone that has a pressure injury on their buttocks or on the kind of that seated surface. So let's say I do have a pressure injury on my sacrum or tailbone. I can measure someone in that supine position. But ideally you want to measure someone in a seated position, because we're measuring for a seated surface. And if you are measuring someone in supine or in a lying position for a seated surface, things like range of motion, the absence of gravity, that all comes into play and might affect my measurements as well. In some cases, you do have adjustability with chair armrests. So you do want to take into account someone's armrest measurements as well, if there is a possibility to adjust it. Because if you have an armrest that's too high, someone's going to sit with their shoulders in an uncomfortable position. Or what happens more often is having actually an armrest that's too low, and people actually want to be able to increase the armrest height. And that's where someone might struggle to do a sit to stand, because they're struggling to actually push off from those too low armrests. Because there's a point where there's not as much movement. Like I can't really push myself up as much because my armrests are too low. When you look at our bariatric clients, they actually end up having almost smaller measurements. So their seat depth and seat height are sometimes smaller than your non-bariatric clients' measurements, which can be confusing, because a lot of times it's actually the seat width that is the bigger measurement and not seat width and seat height. But when we've adapted how we've done our measurements for a bariatric client, we need to be able to adjust our chair. So if we have a bariatric client that has that gluteal shelf, that additional body mass by the buttocks, we are going to end up having a too deep seat depth. So by ignoring the gluteal shelf and rather taking that measurement from the scapula, so if you draw a measuring line from the scapula downwards to the bottom of your seat, and you rather take the measurement from back of the calves then behind the knees, you'll end up with a quite short seat depth. Now, you're going to think, oh, what's going to happen? Because if I sit in a too short seat depth, where does that gluteal shelf go? Where does the buttocks go? So this is why we have things like tension adjustable backrests with all wheelchairs, but why it's also good to have a bariatric chair where you can take stuffing out of your cushions, especially that bottom cushion. So you could potentially be taking out majority of the stuffing or filling from your bottom cushion and actually allow the person's buttocks to fully kind of go into the backrest or into your seat, and then have your top pillows a bit more forward and actually supporting the back. Okay, so let's do a recap of today's episode. We went through why size is important, or why getting the right fit recliner is important, and how it affects your pressure distribution, your posture, your ability to do a safe and efficient transfer. And then we looked at some very specific seat dimensions and how we can go wrong with them, and what is important to consider when we're measuring for those dimensions. So the ones that we looked at was our seat width, our seat height and seat depth, as well as our leg rest length. And then also looking at how there are differences between your non-bariatric clients and your bariatric clients when you're actually doing your measurements. And then we ended with just some general seating measurement tips or guidelines to make sure that you're getting the most accurate measurements for those seating prescriptions. We'd love to hear from you in the comments. Let us know if you have a story about getting the right size recliner, or even not getting the right size, and how you managed to navigate that.